seems like the only time I get on and do one of these things is when enough stuff has happened that I get pissed off enough that I finally decide I need to say something. So I suppose this is going to be my latest tirade about ignorance, general ignorance, and no one is exempt from this kind of ignorance. The reason why it makes me pissed off is simply because this kind of ignorance is so easy to prevent. It is so easy to relieve yourself of this ignorance. And it just reminds me of what I've recently been reading about Anton LaVey and his what he discovered about what Don Webb has called his three revelations about bullshit. And one of these is that, and it's true, is that most people would rather believe bullshit than the truth, because truth is complicated, and oftentimes bullshit, especially public or socially mediated bullshit, is an attempt to simplify complicated things, or is simply a means by which to try to get you to sign on to somebody's viewpoint. So this is what I'm tirading about today. The first is the whole business about Juneteenth. I have had so many of my friends, and these are people who you would consider to be good liberal people, whatever the hell that means anymore, who just don't understand what Juneteenth is, or why we should have a holiday now, or what that's about, or, you know, and it was all kind of brought to a head yesterday at a Sufi meeting that I attended, where the person who was leading the Sufi meeting, who is a good person, you know, a liberal person, you know, whatever that means now, basically said that she just didn't understand what Juneteenth was. And could anybody here tell her? And did anybody have an opinion about what it was? And I just said, listen, this is easy. You look it up. If you don't want to look it up on Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has its problems, look it up in the online Encyclopedia Britannica, for God's sake. I mean, look it up. This is a Googleable topic, and it's not something that's just subject to opinion. I mean, what you can opine about is whether or not you think there should be a national holiday or not. But what Juneteenth is not a debate. It's very simply the date. June 19th is just very simply the date when some enslaved people, you know, African Americans who were enslaved people in the state of Texas, finally heard about the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the executive order that Abraham Lincoln issued in order to tell the slaves that they were free, essentially. And there was a political reason behind this. It was thought that perhaps if slaves understood that they had been emancipated by the administration in Washington, that they might defect en masse and destabilize the South in certain ways. So it was a political move on the part of Abraham Lincoln, and it was not uncontested at the time. In fact, he had thought about this. He and some of his strategists had thought about this for a while, but it wasn't until the Battle of Gettysburg when it became very, very clear that the South was going to lose the battle, that it was going to be, or the war, that the Civil War was going to be a war of attrition, which it turned out to be for the next while. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, it was very clear that the Confederacy was not going to win. And so it was after that Abraham Lincoln decided that he would go ahead and take the plunge and emancipate the slaves. And so but of course, the many people in the southern states, especially the administration of the southern states in Richmond, didn't want slaves to know this. Slave owners didn't want their enslaved populations to know this. And so, and there wasn't mass communication then like there is now. So it took a number of months for that information to reach people in Texas. And so that's what Juneteenth is. Now, there, in fact, is no one date for Juneteenth. That's why they call it Juneteenth, is because it was at different times in June that people in Texas heard this. But the 19th of June has sort of been picked as sort of the middle of the month. And it's been celebrated, Juneteenth has been celebrated in African American communities across the country for over 100 years. And it's been almost 100 years that various groups of people have tried to get this to be a national holiday, to celebrate the ending of slavery, which, whether we celebrate Juneteenth or we celebrate the day when the 13th Amendment was ratified, which outlaws slavery, I personally think that the celebrating of this particularly pernicious institution is something to celebrate, at least legally. I don't have an issue with it. And of course, I don't obviously have a logistical issue with it personally, because I get a paid holiday in the state of New York. So I'm not going to gripe about it at any time. But the point is that the information about what Juneteenth is and its road to becoming a holiday is out there. It's not arcane. It's not a leftist plot. It's out there, and it's something that's been out there for a really long time. It just blows my mind that even the information about it is considered to be controversial. It's like, for God's sake, just look it up. What is the issue with that? I basically confronted this person in this meeting about that, and I said, why didn't you just look it up? This isn't an issue that needs to, you can, like I said, you can debate whether you think it should be a national holiday or not, but its existence as something is not questioned. It's always been there at least for over 100 years. It's like, for God's sake. And connected to that is another thing that has been floating through the internet. And I worried about this. I've worried about this for several years, which is why in a number of different interviews on fascism that I've given in the last couple of years, or presentations on fascism, I've specifically mentioned this, because I knew that eventually some idiot or bunch of idiots, or, maybe people that are not idiots, but they're doing this on purpose, would bring this up. And this is the notion that the Nazis were leftists and not rightists. Okay, first of all, to dispel that illusion, all you need to do is consult Hitler. And all you need to do is consult the principles of the Nazi Party. And all you need to do is consult the principles of fascism, which pre-existed the Nazi Party as a political ideology and was actually formulated formally by Mussolini, all right? They are very clear that this, at least Mussolini is, that he considers this to be a right-wing political ideology. And then in the US, all you have to do is consult the fact that I can't think of a single Nazi group in the United States who has existed, who has been organized, that has not identified with the right, fundamentally. Whether or not they share some prescriptions with the left, in the sense that there are some neo-Nazis now who are eco-Nazis. In other words, they're Nazis, they're fascists about everything, except they will embrace environmental movements, because even they have come to understand that if you destroy the planet, then you destroy white people too. So, It's like, yeah, you'll get stuff like that, hybrids like that. But fascism, of which Nazism was an expression, has always definitely been right-wing in origin. Now, that does not mean that they did not use the word socialism, and this is the Nazi Party, socialism, or the National Socialist Party, as their party. But this points out two things. The first thing it points out is that socialism is not a political order. It's an economic order. It's a manner in which economic systems are organized. And socialism as an economic system can be organized in any number of ways. It can be organized the way in which the Soviet Union organized it, in which case they called themselves a federal socialism. Socialism can be organized in the way it's often organized in Scandinavia, and it's called democratic socialism. Okay, democratic being the way in which political decisions are made. Socialism, in that that's the type of economic practices that the country assumes. So it's democratic socialism. This is a socialism that is decided in a democratic process by the people. All right, so you can see the difference there. National socialism means something very different. It means that the nation is what the focus is, the ideal of the nation. And that's what fascism is really about. Fascism is a kind of ideology, it's a religious ideology. And Mussolini is actually pretty clear about this, that it is to operate kind of like a religion, where you have a charismatic leader. They use hypernationalism in order to create the sense that the nation is kind of the body to whom everyone should give allegiance. All right. So it's the nation that's first, not the people that are first, but the idea of the nation that is first. And then socialism is the economic order, the way in which the economic activities of the people are going to be subsumed under this idea of the nation. And that's what fascism is. Fascism is an authoritarian structure in which the idea of the nation and the structures of the nation become the ordering principle of a population. And it's led by a charismatic leader or a charismatic party who basically take all the economic activities of the nation and mold those economic activities to the service of the nation. All right? That's very different than what classic socialism would be, and it is certainly different than what Marx envisioned. In fact, Marx himself, if you actually read Marx, I know nobody here reads Marx, but if you actually read Marx, you'll find that he doesn't like socialism either. That's why he believes that eventually human beings are going to evolve out of capitalism and socialism and eventually create a common good for everyone called communism. Now, do I think that he's right about that? Hell, I don't know. I haven't noticed that people think much beyond their own navels, so thinking about their neighbor is an entirely different thing. And certainly Marx's ideal of communism seems very utopian to us, and I don't particularly think that it's not something that you could promote in any kind of way. And even he talks about it in the sense that it's kind of an evolution of soul or an evolution of heart. It would most resemble, by the way, what you see in Star Trek, except that in Star Trek you don't have to have a collective owning of the means of production because everybody has access to the resources that they need, through technology. So in a sense, even what Marx envisioned as communism is no longer necessary. The point is that neither the Soviet Union actually ever did that, nor does Russia do that, since Russia is basically a kleptocracy by now. And China has never done that. So even though they both refer to themselves as communist states, they were not actually in structure. And the Nazi Party, the National Socialism, was socialism in a sense, but it was not socialism in a leftist sense. And this should let you know that whatever socialism is, it can be right or left. You see, it's the way in which an economic process is ordered. It is not necessarily the political ideology that is so ordering it. All right. And this is a subtlety that, of course, is lost on people who don't think and just get hung up on certain words like socialism. The other thing about the National Socialists, about the Nazis, is that Hitler was very, very clear, especially after the Munich Putsch, the attempt of the initial Nazi party, the brown shirts, to kind of begin the revolution in the early 1920s. They failed at that, and it was because of that Hitler was imprisoned, and then he wrote Mein Kampf, and all this other stuff happened later. All right, but one of the lessons that was learned by the early nascent what would become the Nazi Party was that in order for them to succeed, they would have to appeal to the working classes. And at that time, the working classes were socialists. They were tending towards socialism. They had been influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union in 1917, and they didn't like the Weimar Republic, which was a very weak Republican parliamentary system, and so very cleverly, one of the things that Hitler advised his compatriots who were organizing in the countryside to do was call their group National Socialism, so that it had the word socialism in it, so that they could get those leftist-leaning workers that they needed. In other words, they would be, oh, this is socialism, and they would gravitate towards it, but it wasn't socialism at all. It was fascism. It was a right-wing ideology. The thing about fascism, and Mussolini is very clear about this, is that fascism is a cynical ploy to power. It doesn't care about what words really mean or what the history of words really are. It only cares to use the means necessary in order to seize power. In this sense, it's very much like neoconservatism or neoliberalism in the larger political globalism sense. But the point is that fascism will use the word socialism in order to get, or the Nazis did, in order to get leftists to join it. Now, that being said, I will not deny that there are certain types of socialisms which can become authoritarian. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Joseph Stalin is a perfect example of that. Pol Pot in Cambodia is a perfect example of that. He even called himself a communist. He murdered a third of his own people in his country. So it's like, leftist ideologies can lend themselves to this too, as right-wing ideologies can. Authoritarianism is what fascism is, essentially. It's just the difference between authoritarianism in a large sense is that, say, China is an authoritarian regime, but it is not a fascist regime. And because it doesn't adopt the cynical fascist attitudes about power. It has come to understand as a state that you have to have a certain mix, at least a state of its size. It needs to have a certain mix of free enterprise and government intervention and regulation in order to try to get the whole unwieldy thing, which is China, to work. So you can see it's very complicated, but the fact is that the Nazis were a right-wing organization. All you have to do is read Mein Kampf. All you have to do is consult the actual written sources, And so people who say that they were socialists, that they were leftists, they're idiots. They're just wrong. They're idiots, okay? This connects to how capitalism works. And of course, this is going to fall on deaf ears for those people who are too stupid to know how capitalism works. And I've been saying this now for months, but I will say this again for the very few of you who have not heard it yet. In the summer of 2020, when COVID was reaching its peak, okay, there were a number of different shows that I watched. They were both online. Well, I always watch things online, but in other words, they were both on YouTube. They were webinars. Obviously some of them were on PBS, but some of them were on CNN. Some of them were, there were even some of these things on Fox. Okay. They were on all kinds of things where you had financial advisors coming on and being asked questions about, okay, what is the economic impact of COVID and the shutting down of the world like this going to do to our world economies? And without an exception, almost, these different financial advisors said things like, within the next 2 years, and this is assuming that things are starting to come back to normal in the next 2 years, they said, that there will be probably inflation, that there will probably be risk of recession, that it's going to be very, very difficult for the Federal Reserve to control sort of the fluctuations in currency that are happening across the world, and speculation, that there are going to be service interruptions. As the shipping process gets stopped and started, there's going to be shipping interruptions, manufacturing interruptions. There's going to be all kinds of things. They predicted all of this. Everything we're seeing was predicted almost to a word. This is during the Trump administration, okay? And in fact, several financial advisors that I remember distinctly, they said the problem with what the current administration is doing is because they have overspent in a lot of ways, in certain ways, and they have dried up certain areas of tax gathering revenue because of the tax reforms, quote unquote reforms, that were done early in the Trump presidency. They said this may get worse. It may get worse because our government may have some difficulty regulating our currency in this. This was all predicted. So now we're in it, okay? Now we're in it. And all I hear is complaints. I mean, I paid almost $7 a gallon for the gasoline that I purchased last week to fill it cost me $80 to fill my tank, to fill my car. Yeah, I saw that, it stung, but I also knew where that came from. Okay, it didn't come from the Biden administration. And while it is connected to the oil barons getting their due because they lost out in 2020 and 2021, it's also a process of how complicated the entire petroleum industry is, and the worldwide marketplaces for this. And our government has nothing to do with that and can do virtually nothing about it, okay? And the way our economy and our political system has been set up, because it's not socialistic in that sense, it's almost impossible for us to do anything. So basically what's happening is you have people who are complaining about the high cost of things, which, yeah, it is sticker shock, complaining about the high cost of things, and yet thinking somehow that capitalism would solve that. Like, no, capitalism is the cause of that. And if you are bitching about something that you knew that you were supposed to have known would happen, and now you want the government to do something about it, then you're basically asking for what in your terms would be a socialistic remedy for a problem that capitalism creates. All right. And to that I say, fuck off. Real conservatism, little c conservatism, not what Republicans claim is conservatism, but little c conservatism, what I was raised with, says this: you cannot rely on the government to take care of your basic needs unless you're really, really poor, and then maybe we should all help each other, all right? But your job as a human being in the world is to pay attention to your world and to pay attention to what's going on. And if you understand, because you understand economic processes, that there's going to be a tough time ahead, you prepare for that tough time. You prepare for it. You say, okay, in the next couple of years, things are going to get tight. I'm going to have to think about that. I may have to cut back on certain kinds of expenses. I know that's hard because COVID has kept us all in, and, we want to go out and be privileged Americans and have our vacation or whatever. But you know what? We may not be able to do that in exactly the same way, And if you're too stupid to listen to what's going on and learn how to work and learn how to plan ahead, well, that's your fault. That's not the government's fault. That's nobody's goddamn fault but your own. And if you call yourself a capitalist, but then you want the government to solve your problems, you're not a capitalist. You're an asshole. You're a privileged fucking American is what you are. And you need to stop it. Because it's that kind of bullshit behavior which is causing, all the weird shit on the internet. And it's also causing all kinds of other things, like stupid politics, climate change, and a whole host of other problems that we have, And of course, people don't want to look at themselves and see where they may have contributed to their own issues. So they bitch about somebody else. But real conservatism is taking care of what's immediately around you and understanding at the same time how you're connected. Because real conservatism, which by the way comes from the same, the root of that word comes from the same word, creates the same word as conservation, okay, like as in the ecosystem, basically means that you need to become a self-responsible human being. And if you are a self-responsible human being, then in many cases, things like this, you'll figure out a way to cope. Now, that being said, granted, some of us simply have more resources to do that with than others. And when that's the case, if you are a responsible human being, then you seek to figure out how to help those people or to change the system that you're in so that we can all be helped together. The reason inflation is not high because there are illegal aliens trying to get into the country. Inflation is not high because of black people, okay? Inflation is not high because of woke culture. I haven't experienced culture as being woke, by the way. I experience it as being stupid. So inflation is high basically because there were a number of missteps that were made in our administration prior to, in our country, prior to COVID, and then COVID has exacerbated the situation, not only here, but in the rest of the world. And mostly we have inflation because, hello, America is not the planet. We are connected to everything else, and it's everything else that is also contributing to our current economic situation. So, I could rant about this for like hours. The last thing I'm going to rant about, and I've ranted for almost 30 minutes now, is this crap that's been going around, or information that's been going around about a so-called leftist group that is called Jane's Revenge, that is supposedly organizing large-scale terrorist attacks sometime in the next 2 weeks in anticipation of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So, of course, what I've been seeing are tweets by Mario Rubio, who is, of course, one of the stupidest people on the planet. Anyway, I decided I'd look these people up. Is there a group called, again, look it up. You know what I mean? Do the research. Don't just retweet or post on Facebook to say, see how stupid Mario Rubio is? Just look it up. And the best information I found, interestingly, was on a Catholic news service site, not Huffington Post, not NPR, for those of you who are like, oh, liberals, but a good mainstream Catholic news service, which basically said that what Jane's Revenge is it's actually an internet group. It's not a group really. It's like an internet tag group is what it is. And it's called Jane's Revenge because it's based on off of a documentary, an HBO documentary that was done a little while ago about the Catholic Church's relationship with abortion issues, not only in the United States but also in other countries like Central America, Mexico, South America, and stuff like that. And so basically. And this documentary is called something like The Jane or something like that. And so that's where the term Jane's Revenge comes from. And the groups that are using this as a tag for doing any kind of terrorist actions, And there have been some terrorist actions apparently in Mexico and in a few other places, not just in the United States. But it's not an organized group. It's like people who identify online as leftist anarchists, or just as anarchists, basically, are going around and doing things. So there have been a few, like maybe 2 or 3, actually verified actions that involved some kind of violence or attempted violence in the United States. There was one pro-life pregnancy center, I think it was in Wisconsin, that was firebombed, not very successfully, but was firebombed, and the people who did it claimed that they were part of the group called Jane's Revenge. But it isn't as organized as like Mario Rubio would want you to believe. He in his tweet, he said, there's been over 50 actions and all, and there's this group, and there isn't a group. There is a tagline that some people who claim to be anarchists, if they do this, they can say, we're part of this. All right. I'm not saying that this justifies what they're doing. I'm just saying it's not as organized as all that. So but again, you can find this out by looking it up. It's not rocket science. It took me literally less than a minute to find all the basic information that I needed to find about Jane's Revenge in order to go, oh, okay, this is what's going on here. And there haven't been 50 actions, and it isn't an organized group. Doesn't mean that there aren't some people who haven't done some stupid stuff, but it's not even leftists, it's anarchists. And anarchists can be leftists or rightists or something else, which, by the way, this is the last thing I'll say about the Nazis. The Nazis understood fascism as being a political ideology that would organize economic activity in a fashion differently than capitalism or socialism. And that's why they referred to their version of fascism as the third way. That is literally what they called it, the third way. So for them, it was not, even though it came out of the right, it was not, it would ultimately, in their minds, when it flowered, it would ultimately be neither right-wing nor left-wing. It would be a third option, and that's how they saw fascism. That being said, in almost every instance I can think of, fascism has come out of the right. At least in the West, has come out of the right. Authoritarian regimes can come out of anything, but, fascism as an ideology has come out of the right. And because of its reliance on a charismatic leader, and because it resembles in many ways a religious cult, and certainly certain types of fundamentalist religious cults, that's how it has been able to ally itself to religious evangelical causes. In Germany, of course, it allied itself to both the Lutheran and Catholic Church. Here in the United States, of course, it has spawned not only its own religious movements in Christian identity, or is connected to Christian identity in British Israelite groups, but it has clearly connected itself to certain types of Christian evangelical groups. And this is quite distinct, actually, from leftist politics, because leftist politics tends to be agnostic or atheistic. Except in the United States, you will have what's called progressive politics, often be resembling more, progressive politics resembling more what is often called leftist. But that's a subject for a whole other thing, because progressivism itself can also be right or left wing. Anyway, my rant is over. I'm dead tired. Take this and just, whatever it is, look it up. Just for God's sake, do some research before I have to reach through the screen and strangle you for not doing your due diligence. That's all I ask. And it's not hard. You do not have to be a super brain. I mean, I'm kind of a super brain. It's beginning to drip out now, but I'm kind of a super brain. You don't have to be a super brain. Know how to do a Google search. Please. Save a life.